Ethan Carter was the kind of student every school dreamed of, the kind that made teachers relax during exams, the kind that made parents proud without even trying. Because Ethan didn't just perform well in school, he dominated it. From the very beginning, it was clear he wasn't ordinary. While other children struggled to understand basic concepts, Ethan would finish entire chapters before lessons even ended. Teachers would give him problems meant for advanced students, and he would solve them effortlessly, almost as if the answers were already written somewhere in his mind. By the time he reached secondary school, something unusual had already formed around him, a reputation, not just as a smart student, but as a guaranteed success. If Ethan was in your class average was safe. If Ethan wrote an exam, the highest score was already decided. And slowly, without anyone noticing, Ethan stopped being treated like a student and started being treated like a result. His teachers would say things like, just check Ethan's answer, even before marking papers. Students would whisper, if Ethan got it wrong, then we're all wrong. And at home, his father reinforced it even more. Ethan, he would say firmly, the world only remembers excellence. Anything less is forgettable. So Ethan learned something early in life, not creativity, not curiosity, but precision, correctness, perfection. And it worked until it didn't. Because somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped asking questions that had no fixed answers. He stopped exploring things that couldn't be tested, and without realizing it, he built his entire identity around one belief. If I am always right, I will always succeed. But life was already preparing something he could never study for, something no exam could prepare him for. There was a moment in school that seemed small at the time, but later would become important. A classmate once asked him casually during break time, Ethan, what do you actually enjoy doing besides studying? Ethan paused. It wasn't a difficult question, it was just unfamiliar. After a few seconds, he replied carefully, I enjoy solving problems efficiently. There was silence. Then someone laughed, not loudly, but enough. And Ethan didn't understand why, because in his world, that was a perfect answer. But that moment stayed with him longer than any exam result ever had, because deep down, something strange began forming inside him. A question he couldn't calculate. Why do people value things that don't have correct answers? He ignored it because ignoring uncertainty had always worked before. And then came the final year of school, the national exams, the moment everyone feared, but Ethan had been preparing for his entire life. He didn't panic like others. He didn't revise frantically. He didn't doubt himself. Instead, he followed his routine with calm precision because in his mind, success was already decided. The only thing left was execution. And when the results came out, Ethan Carter achieved something almost unreal, a perfect score, 100%, national top performance. His school celebrated like history had been made. Teachers praised him, students applauded him, his parents cried with pride, and Ethan, he simply nodded, not because he was ungrateful, but because in his mind, this was not the peak. It was just the continuation of what had always been happening. He believed life would keep following the same pattern: study, success, reward, but he was wrong because school was a closed system and life was not. Graduation arrived like a celebration: music, speeches, applause, photos, everything felt like an ending. But for Ethan, it felt like a pause he didn't understand because for the first time in his life, there was no syllabus, no exam paper, no guaranteed next step, just an open world. And Ethan didn't know it yet. But open worlds do not reward perfect answers, they reward adaptation. And Ethan had never trained for that, not once. That night, after graduation, he sat alone in his room, surrounded by certificates, awards, perfect records. And yet, he felt something strange, not happiness, not sadness, just silence. A silence that felt too large for his life, and somewhere in that silence, his perfect world quietly began to crack. University was supposed to be the continuation of success. At least, that's what Ethan believed. And at first, it was. He still excelled academically, still topped exams, still understood lectures faster than others. But slowly, something began to shift because university was no longer just about knowledge, it was about people, it was about communication, it was about uncertainty. And Ethan struggled with all three, not because he was incapable, but because he had never needed them before. He had been trained to think alone, to solve alone, to succeed alone, but now everything required interaction, group work, presentations, networking, conversations without correct answers. And for the first time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar: confusion, then discomfort, then silence. Recruiters came to campus during his second year, companies, internships, opportunities, and Ethan applied confidently because in his mind, this was still a test. And tests had answers, but interviews did not. The first rejection came quietly, no explanation, just an email. The second one came the same way, then the third, then more, until Ethan started reading feedback that didn't make sense to him. Lacks communication presence, too rigid in thinking, not adaptable, rigid. That word stayed with him. Because in school, rigid had meant correct. Now it meant rejected. And that contradiction slowly started breaking something inside him. Because for the first time, being right was not enough. One interview stayed with him longer than others. He entered confidently, sat down, answered every question with structure and clarity. He was prepared, he was precise, he was correct. Then the interviewer leaned forward and said, "Tell me about the time you failed." Ethan blinked, just once. And then he answered honestly, "I have never failed academically." There was silence, not confusion, not curiosity, just silence. The interviewer nodded politely, smiled faintly, and said, "That's all for today. We'll get back to you." Ethan already knew before leaving the room. He had failed, but not in the way he understood failure. That night, something changed in him. He sat alone again, surrounded by everything he had ever done right. And yet, nothing felt useful anymore. For the first time in his life, he questioned his entire foundation. If everything I've done is correct, why does nothing here recognize it? And that question had no answer. Because life doesn't grade you, it responds to you. And Ethan had never learned how to respond, only how to be correct. Months passed, then years slowly started blending into repetition. Applications, rejections, attempts, failures. And slowly, Ethan began watching people he once considered average begin to move ahead of him, not because they were more intelligent, but because they could adapt. They could speak freely. They could fail without breaking. They could adjust without collapsing. And Ethan could not. Because every time he tried to change, it felt like abandoning everything he was trained to be. And that's when he realized something painful. School had not prepared him for life, it had prepared him for exams, and exams were gone. One evening, sitting in a small empty apartment, Ethan stared at his certificates again: perfect grades, perfect records, perfect history, and still no direction. And in a quiet voice, almost like speaking to himself, he said, "If I am this correct, why is everything still wrong?" No answer came, just silence. And that silence felt heavier than failure because failure still gives feedback. Silence gives nothing. And Ethan was beginning to realize life was not rejecting him. It was simply not responding to him at all. And that was the beginning of the real collapse. Not of his intelligence, but of his certainty. Years passed. Ethan was no longer a student, but he was not yet successful either. He existed somewhere in between, not failing, not thriving, just stuck. And that state was more painful than either extreme. Until one day, he decided to return to his old school, not because he had answers, but because he had none left. The building felt smaller now, quieter, almost unfamiliar. A teacher recognized him immediately. "You are our best student." Ethan smiled faintly, but it didn't feel like pride. It felt like distance. "I don't think that matters anymore," he said. The teacher looked at him carefully, then said something that stopped him completely. "You were trained to answer questions, not live without them." That sentence didn't just enter Ethan's mind, it stayed there, it repeated, it echoed, because it was the truth he had been avoiding his entire life. That night, something shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but permanently. Ethan made a decision not to chase perfection anymore, but to learn something school never taught him: adaptation, communication, uncertainty, failure. Right? He went back into education later, but this time not as someone trying to prove he was right, but as someone learning how to exist in a world without certainty. Years later, Ethan stood in front of a lecture hall, but this time he was not the student, he was the professor. And when he spoke, his voice carried something different: not perfection, but understanding. "I used to get 100% in everything I did," he said. A pause. "But life doesn't reward perfection, it rewards adaptation." He looked at the students and added something softer. "The smartest student in school is not always the most successful in life, because school tests correctness, but life tests flexibility." And in that moment, Ethan finally understood something he had spent his entire life chasing without realizing. Being right means nothing if you cannot survive when there is no right answer. And for the first time, he didn't feel like the smartest student. He didn't feel like a failure. He didn't feel like anything defined. He just felt like someone finally is learning how to live.